Beyond the Gates spoilers tease that Joey wants Vanessa to sever every tie with Doug and move in with him permanently, even going so far as to insist she take off her wedding ring. That while Vanessa hesitates, she is pulled deeper into a dangerous web in which Joey's casino dealings and alleged money laundering escalate around her, that Doug has gambled himself into ruin and might be in immediate peril, that Vanessa begins to receive thinly veiled threats about the suspicious transactions tied to her real estate business and is forced into a choice between exposing Joey or joining him, and that the dominoes already set in motion are crashing toward a night that could destroy their family. The decision did not arrive as a thunderclap. It was a slow, corrosive erosion, beginning with the small bright thing that Joey laid on the hotel nightstand, an envelope that smelled faintly of cigar smoke and sea salt. Vanessa touched it with a fingertip as if it might burn her. The cash was clinical and cold, stacked neat as pebbles. He watched her from the bed, half amused, half calculating, the way predators watch prey decide whether to trust a new path. "Wait," she said, but the hotel room was already a stage. Down the hall the minibar hummed, the AC pressed a steady white noise against the windows, and the soft Puerto Rican dusk folded the city into a blur of lights. Joey's voice was syrup and iron. "Take it. Put it in. We'll call it a deposit. We do this and no one has to keep worrying about Doug." It was the first time she'd heard him say Doug's name with that lightness, the way someone might sign a receipt. She had always been careful with names. Her line of work, real estate, open houses, handshakes that promised futures depended on them. She kept ledgers in her head and spreadsheet tidy truths in her office drawer. Yet the envelope lay on her palm like a verdict she'd been waiting for and pretending she'd never asked for. She imagined the ledger burning as Joey smoothed the bills. A part of her that had been starving for permission leaned in and wanted to believe that permission had arrived in the shape of a holiday, a man who made everything feel like an upgrade. Another part, older and harder, remembered the way Doug laughed when he was happy, the low, ridiculous cackle in the kitchen when he'd found a new golf club or a ridiculous fishing hat. That laugh had priced 1,000 small, private moments she hadn't thought she'd trade. "You don't have to decide tonight," Joey murmured, but he was saying the opposite by the way his fingers closed over the edge of the duvet. He wanted a ring removed before the sun rose over a new life. He wanted absolution without history. Doug's downfall was a weather event that began as a storm cloud and then through a sequence of roughly embarrassed choices and the smoky glamour of a man convinced luck would turn became something much worse. He was a gambler in the sentimental sense, a man who believed risk could be brokered into a clean slate. He walked into Joey's world like a man looking for a dealer who would cut him the best hand. What he left with was nothing but a pocket lighter and a brush take of shame. The sequence was easy to imagine because Doug had been obvious about his itch. He had told a friend that the only thing that killed stakes was death. He was a man who had always converted worry into motion. That motion had carried him to a place where he lost not just money but the thin film of dignity that had kept him as an equal at home. He came home later that night with the texture of the casino lights still in his eyes and the smell of someone else's cologne on his collar. He tried to tuck honesty into a joke about a bad hand. Vanessa saw the way his fingers trembled over a coffee cup and recognized it as the thing that had eaten their savings. She confronted him, but a man like Doug insulated himself with self-delusion. He promised he would fix it. He borrowed a blank look and called it determination. Joey already had the ledger she didn't know she'd been writing for him. There is a particular violence to threats delivered in small notes, in a voice message that stops mid-breath, in a man who says this will be better for everyone as if coercion wore a ribbon. Vanessa began to receive those cheap little violations, a text with a photo of one of her ledgers, an anonymous email flagged for your eyes only, an acquaintance from a closing who warned her to be careful who you work with. The warnings were delivered like feathers, meant to irritate and raise the itch until she scratched. The people at the edges of Joey's life, men with suits that fit not because of tailoring but because of how they bought people's silence, wanted her to understand the currency of complicity. If she played along, they suggested, everyone would be fine. If she didn't, the ledger could be a smoking gun. The inner debate was less a moral calculus and more a mapping of what she would lose with each choice. If she stood beside Doug, she would be choosing the slow, humiliating path of making truth small enough to live with. She would inherit the right to call him husband publicly while privately bartering their past with a legal team and late-night meetings, handing over bank statements like trinkets. There would be exposure, yes, the possibility of her business's reputation shredded not by malice but by association. She envisioned clients looking at her hand and seeing debt, whispers moving faster than deals. But she also imagined rebuilding, a hard season of apologizing, a litany of therapy, public contrition, and then, perhaps, a different, cleaner life. If she chose Joey, she would gain immediate sanctuary and passion but surrender certain things she'd built on her own brand equity, the trust of her community, a marriage that, while frayed, still harbored warmth. Choosing Joey was choosing to let the world know she had been in the backroom, that she had accepted cash that had smelled of other people's mistakes. The legal consequences loomed like a shape in fog, a subpoena, an audit, a ledger parsed for intent versus ignorance. There is a theater to blackmail, it is rehearsed to make the victim feel helpless. Joey knew the choreography and taught it to others the way one teaches a game. He moved in fronts of charm and a sideways arrogance, suggesting alternatives with the ease of someone offering a menu. He offered her ownership half of his casino's pie if she removed her ring and lived publicly with him. He suggested that marriage was a complication he could manage as long as she stepped into his life completely. He suggested that death was a tidy solution to debt, a murky sentence that leaked something dangerous into Vanessa's gut because Joey's metaphor for clearing the board often came with undertones that made it clear he meant it literally. She begged him, once, in the hum of a hotel lobby that smelled of lemon cleaner and expensive leather, to show mercy for Doug. She asked him to imagine love and not just outcomes. Joey smiled in a way that told her he did not imagine love, he imagined leverage. Doug's evening at the casino, a slip into an underworld of numbers and faces that all had the same kind of desperation, was captured in cut scenes in Vanessa's head. He'd argued he was there to get a read, he said he would fold, but he kept placing chips with the kind of hand that wanted to prove something to itself. The dealer's eyes were a practiced neutrality. Money changed hands like weather. He had tried to bluff, failed, borrowed against a line he didn't have, and then watched the app on his phone tilt toward red until the numbers were grotesque. When Marcel, a detective who had been hovering in rumor and shadow, arrived, Doug froze. It was one of those moments where you know you've been filmed for a documentary you did not consent to. Marcel had the authority of someone who takes aside the stagehands. The world narrowed to fluorescent lights and the overly loud music of a casino showroom where applause sounded like knives. Doug's phone pinged with a message from Vanessa asking if he was okay. He typed back a lie and then a second text that read, "I'll deal with it." His hands trembled where she could see the ring that now looked heavier than any object should. When the police hand touched his shoulder, there was a newness to his fear. It felt like the stern hand of a man who had finally been measured and found wanting. Back home, the twins' two information engines with a soft center of panic felt the city shrink into an absence. They called their parents' unlit numbers until their thumbs ached. They searched their rooms for notes, for the glint of a ring on a bedside table, for the kinds of adult proof that would tell them everything was normal, and found only a silence with an odd timetable. They split the map of the adults' lives between them. One went to the place where Vanessa sometimes held meetings, the other to the clinic where Doug volunteered. Both returned with nothing, faces lifted up and small in a world that suddenly grew too big. Panic can make you fast, it can make you careless. One of them, in a hurry to cross a busy street they'd walked without paying attention 100 times before, misjudged a delivery truck's turn. Metal and sound do not negotiate. The accident was a punctuation that arrived like a bell, screeching rubber, a phone falling from a pocket, someone shouting a name. The ambulance lights were comic books flung into real life. When the hospital called, Vanessa listened to the sterile voice offering details that sounded too big to fit her chest. One of the twins safe, ambulances said, but with fractures and a concussion. A list of injuries that would stitch and bruise was alive. The relief and guilt collided inside her like bodies in a crowded elevator. She learned the smaller, crueler detail that the call had been made by a man who said he'd found the child unconscious and bleeding. He was an attendant who had been at the scene but not a police officer. He mentioned a note, a folded business card with an unfamiliar logo found near the child's fall. The coincidence was the wrong kind of coincidence. It tasted like a hand reaching for proof. Vanessa's first responses were raw. She wept on the phone, words leaking like oil from a cracked seal. She began to think about the ledger carried in her palm in Puerto Rico and wondered whether paper could be traced to ruin by threads she could not see. Guilt is a particular kind of parasite. It lights on the eyes and refuses to look away. Vanessa replayed the last months in a loop and found herself equally culpable for the things she had done and for the things she had not. She imagined a scale where choosing Joey tipped one way and choosing Doug tipped another, and she felt the fulcrum under her foot. She considered telling the police about Joey's accounts, about the envelope, about the men who spoke in low voices. She imagined the scene, detectives at her office, subpoenas, her name in small print under the phrase money laundering. She thought of her clients, of the glossy brochures, and of the way an accusation travels faster than an investigation. She thought of the twins and how her face would take on a particular kind of history in their minds. A mother who chose desire or a mother who saved them. Only the knowledge that any step from this point would redraw the outlines of her life. When Vanessa called Doug from the hospital lobby between tests and prescription instructions, the conversation ran as if through a fogged glass. He spoke in short sentences, the ones that have been practiced to carry news while preserving something of dignity. He told her he was okay, that he had been questioned at the casino and released with a notice for a later court date, that the city would be busy for a while. She asked where he was, and he said he was trying to get to the twins. She asked if he had money for the medical bills, and he made a sound like a small animal. It was the sound she recognized as a man seeing his family's map erode. He said little, and when he tried to reassure her, the lie was brittle and quick. Vanessa wanted to condemn him, to blame him, to use the calving pain as a wedge, but she found only a need to shelter him. Doug had been a partner in things both tender and disastrous. She could not, in that small, fluorescent space, decide to keep or tear the marriage. Decision was a luxury when the children needed stitches. Joey called while she sat in the hospital cafeteria, watching the twins' ice packs melt into cold puddles. He wanted a play-by-play, all the while sounding interested but distant. He wanted Vanessa to be frightened on his behalf and reassured by his presence. He suggested that the hospital was a stress test that proved how much she needed someone who could cut through chaos. If you want, he said, you can do it clean. It was a phrase Vanessa had heard before. Clean was his brand of amoral moralizing. He suggested again that she take off the ring, that she make a clean break. When she said nothing, he reminded her of the envelope and the men she had seen in a car 2 nights before. Threats from his world were like seasonal allergies. They might make you wheeze and cough, but, he implied, they were survivable with the right treatment. She found herself thinking about God and the odds, about a courtroom and a hospital bed, and about a man in a casino who declared death as an acceptable balancing of ledgers. Vanessa's days began to split into 2 speeds, the domestic, urgent tempo prescribed by doctors and homework, and the clinical, statistical tick of debts and accounting. She spent afternoons on hold with insurance companies and evenings with a lawyer who had no sentiment for the mess. She wore her grief plainly, because hiding it would have meant outsourcing the truth to shame. Yet in the small hours, when the hospital corridor hummed with air and the night shift nurse chatted about non-essential trivia, Vanessa's mind turned to memory in a different way. She remembered the first time she and Doug had signed papers for a modest house with peeling paint and a bright porch. She remembered painting the nursery together while arguing about which lamp to choose, all of it a kind of small bravery. She remembered thinking, then, that this was what stability felt like, slow, predictable, and patient. None of that stopped her from wanting, in sudden bursts, something that felt like being chosen wholly and without negotiation. In private, Joey's argument was brutal in its simplicity: choose him, because with him problems could be made to disappear in ways that seemed efficient and absolute. He offered an illusion of control. With him, the ledger could be written over, because power had a way of reassigning consequences. He framed the world as a set of resources and traders, not moral actors. Vanessa watched him position these options with the serenity of someone negotiating for the last piece of furniture in a showroom. Her chest pulled at the memory of his touch, fierce and uncomplicated, as if passion could anesthetize the legal consequence of a misdeed. And then, in the quiet, she would think of Doug's wrists, the way he worried a pen when nervous, and of the way he forgot to lock his car sometimes. She feared a life where passion would be the only currency while everything else would be taxed mercilessly. Her friends began to notice the marginless look in her eyes and offered the kind of help people offer when they are trying to measure the depth of a storm from a safe place. Some suggested she leave the city, start over. Others said she should go public, clear the air by confessing to what she had done or not done. The advice was a crowd chorus of second-hand morality. Vanessa found that she could not accept the radical options when they neglected the tiny human truths that anchored her. Leaving would abandon Doug to whatever fate he had wrought, and confession would put her children into a liminal space with strangers asking questions they did not deserve. She felt, increasingly, like a woman being asked to choose the shape of an unknown destiny with only a dim flashlight. The stakes grew when an envelope arrived at her office 2 days later, the kind of envelope you learn to dread, heavy, without a return address, and sealed with a neat strip of tape. Inside was a photograph of Doug asleep on a park bench, a plain shot, grainy and cruel, and a short note that read, "We keep our books clean. You should too." The photograph said the right thing plainly. Someone had been watching. Vanessa sat at her kitchen table and burned the photo in the sink, watching it curl black and drop into water. The image widened the distance between her and any possible easy solution. She could hand it to the police, she could hand it to Joey, or she could keep it. Each choice carried a different kind of violence. She put the ash in a Ziploc, like evidence, and breathed. That night, the twins slept like children who had used up their panic on the day. Vanessa sat at their bedside, hands folded over the small arc of their bodies, and tried to imagine how to keep them safe in a world that had begun to ring with alarms. She touched the faint warmth of their hair and thought about the ledger, about choices, about whether people deserve second chances. She thought of redemption as a fragile machinery of slow work, of long conversations and unlikely reforms. She thought, unwillingly, that Joey's proposals were a form of bribery dressed as liberation, and that Doug's ruin was both the result of habit and an indictment of a man who had always looked for another hand to hold in the dark. In the morning she made a list of practical things: filing for medical leave, checking lawyers, talking to their school counselor. She also made a smaller, secret list that she could not bring herself to show anyone: people who might help if she confessed, people who might protect her if she didn't, and unknown players who could make the ledger disappear. The secret list felt like a small leverage device, 1 part map and 2 parts hope. She did not know which she would use, but she kept the list folded in her wallet next to an old photograph of her and Doug laughing, the kind of photograph that made the present ache. She went to see Joey, because people who live in divided houses keep trying to reconcile the two halves by walking through the rooms where both halves breathe. He met her in a private room at the casino, dim and scented with something luxurious. He was all charm, even the way he folded his hands seemed designed to be trustworthy. He told her not to make a rash decision, not to let fear determine her next move. Then he asked, in the casual way of men used to making demands as if they were offers, whether she had considered that removing the ring would be the easiest practical step forward. He called it logistics, as if affection were merely a logistical problem. Vanessa realized with a cold clarity that Joey used language to strip things of intimacy and render them administrable. She had, until now, wanted him to be one thing, a lover who rescued her from chaos, but increasingly he resembled another thing entirely: the head of an enterprise who measured people by their utility. Her choice remained withheld like a dull command lit by a pale lamp. She had not decided, and the world around her had started to measure out consequences for her indecision. Doug's court date hovered like a shadow. The twins healed, but with a stiffness and memory. The strangers at the edges of Joey's life made small threats, and Vanessa's phone continued to ring with numbers she did not recognize. The hospital bills arrived with a cruel neutrality that made math seem like a moral test. In the end, the first phase of the story was not a decision so much as an accumulation of losses, of pressure, of intimacy that made new demands. The city around them continued to breathe, indifferent, while Vanessa stood at a window and looked at a horizon that promised nothing other than more complex decisions to come. The phone buzzed on the table, and she stared at it as if the next ring might provide a shape she could live inside.